أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Indeed, thank you, Dr. Humayun. Indeed, the title of tonight's discourse is The Attainment of Wisdom, and it's a Ramadan reflection. It's just some reflections which I would like to share with you. And indeed, Ramadan is a time of reflection. And given the, how shall I put it, peculiar historical circumstances in which we find ourselves, which are altogether unprecedented, all the more reason to take some time to reflect. I'm aware that many, if not most, of the people who are attendees, regular attendees at the IJA, are native speakers of Persian. So at least the hadith in the Quran, which I will quote, I will try and give a translation or quote from a translation. So my discourse, my lecture is, rasidan bi hikmat or rasidan bi khirad, the attainment to reach to wisdom. And what does that mean? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second surah of the Quran, in verse or ayat number 269, He says, يُؤْتِ الْحِكْمَةَ مَنْ يَشَاءُ وَمَنْ يُؤْتَ الْحِكْمَةَ فَقَدْ أُوتِيَ خَيْرًا كَثِيرًا وَمَا يَذَّكَّرُ إِلَّا أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ. به هر که خواهد حکمت عطا کند و به هر که حکمت عطا شده نیکی فراوان داده شده و جز خردمندان پند نپذیرند. He grants wisdom, he, namely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, excuse me, grants wisdom to whomsoever he wishes. And whomsoever has been granted wisdom has indeed been granted abundant good. And none pay heed save those who possess intellect. Ulul arbab or khiradmandan, as the Persian translation has it. Wisdom, hikmah, khirad, Sophia in Greek, sapientia in Latin. Wisdom is the integral knowledge of the primary causes of all things. Al-asbabul quswa, as Hakim Abu Ali Sina would have said, or also as Aristotle would have said. This is the true aim and goal of philosophy, namely the attainment of wisdom. For true philosophy, as the word indicates, is love of wisdom. Its end result should be an explicative theory of meaning for the realities we experience as understood in relation to their transcendent source, namely Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, both as efficient cause as well as final cause, as telos, as endpoint, as goal. Yet, we live in peculiar times. We live in an age in which the meaning of truth itself has been called into question. What to say of wisdom or something so exalted as God. We live in an intellectual climate of nihilism. That is to say, in an intellectual climate of extreme pessimism and extreme skepticism in matters of knowledge about the world, namely what we would call epistemology, and even to the point of the rejection of the possibility of metaphysics altogether. Metaphysics being a knowledge of things beyond merely the physical world perceivable by the five senses. This profound malaise, this illness, this civilizational sickness has by now sunk, I think, very deep roots, but it has a very long history. I believe that it was first noticed and properly diagnosed by Friedrich Nietzsche, who lived from 1844. He was born in 1844. He died in 1900. So just at the beginning of just before the beginning of the 20th century. He understood that in such a world, belief in God had effectively come to an end, and thus he proclaimed the death of God. Since the death of Nietzsche, subsequent historical developments, such as the death and devastation wrought by the two world wars, only to be followed by yet more senseless and destructive global conflicts, not to mention worldwide poverty, homelessness, unemployment, disease, depression, and an overall general feeling of meaninglessness, seem to have pushed more and more people toward some degree of a nihilistic viewpoint. Indeed, how could it not be? How could it not be this way, since this state of affairs can truly only be described as irrational? Is it surprising then that people should lose all confidence in the notion of rationality when the world they experience is devoid of rationality? Yet it is simply not the case. Just because much of humanity, especially the so-called leaders on the world stage, have failed to adhere to rationality and have relinquished the pursuit of wisdom, of hikmah, of khirad, of sophia, of sapientia, and the practice of virtue, this changes nothing about the essential nature of humanity, which is goodness, and which surprisingly is also the pursuit of the good, the pursuit of wisdom, because human beings have been endowed by their creator with rationality and intelligence, aql. Whether they choose to exercise their free will and use this aql or not is purely up to them. Now, the Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam was asked once by someone, Mal aql? Aql chist? He said, Ma ubida bih al-Rahman wa ktusiba bih al-Jinan. فرمود چیزی است که به وسیله آن خدا را بپرستند و بهشت به دست آرند. He was asked, what is aql? What is the intelligence? What is the intellect? He said, it is that by which the All-Merciful is worshipped and by which the Jannah, Bihisht, is attained to. He was then asked by the Rawi, what then did Muawiyah have? Rawi guyad, guftam, anche Muawiyah dasht che bud? فرمود نیرنگ و شیطنت بود آن مانند عقل است ولی عقل نیست. He said that was but diabolical cunning, and it appears to be intelligence, or it resembles intelligence. It has the likeness, as it were, of intelligence, but it is not intelligence. So it matters not one bit if people do not choose to exercise their faculty of intelligence, human nature remains the same. Nevertheless, the question lingers in the minds of so many. If that is the case, if it's like that, then why is there all this suffering, all this hardship and injustice in the world, all this violence, disease, famine, plague, earthquakes, natural disasters, tyranny, and so on and so on and so on? And they ask, why doesn't God put a stop to it all so we can all live happily ever after? Indeed, many an atheist immersed in the nihilism of our age has made such an argument to deny the very existence of God in the face of such radical and blatant evil. In what remains of my talk, I will try and present a refutation of this argument, but I would like to do that on purely rational grounds without any reference to the Quran or the Hadith, even though I have just cited them, in order that it might be shown, that it might be made clear that this very intelligence, which is mentioned variously in the Quran and the Hadith, is indeed capable of arriving at profound metaphysical truths and ultimately arriving at wisdom itself. We could rephrase the question and say, how could a good God permit evil and suffering? Now, people who believe in God hold that he is all-powerful, what we call in technical language omnipotent, and that he is wholly good or perfectly good. Moreover, there are no limits to what an omnipotent or all-powerful God can do, an all-powerful being, and a perfectly good being would like to eliminate evil and will do so. But look around at the universe, look at the world. Evil exists, which means that God is either not all-powerful, he's not omnipotent, or he is not perfectly good, or he does not exist. We can get rid of the first two possibilities because people who believe in God, they hold that God is omnipotent and perfectly good, and therefore the atheist would argue that God does not exist. However, those two propositions, namely God is omnipotent and perfectly good, and the second, evil exists, both of those are true. God certainly is all-powerful and he is wholly good, and yes, there is evil in the world. But the conclusion that God does not exist does not follow from these premises. Now, in order to convince you rationally, on rational grounds, that this is true, I need to look more closely at what is meant by good and bad, and the equivalent term to bad, evil. And really, what does it mean to say that God has complete and total power, all power, or omnipotence? Let's look at omnipotence, or the idea of God being all-powerful first. By power is meant the capacity to act or to make something. God has a certain kind of capacity, and that is a complete and total all-encompassing capacity. And once you realize or demonstrate the existence of God, which I'm not going to go into today, I can easily do so, and I have in other lectures and so forth that I've given on other occasions. But once you establish the existence of God, it is clear that everything other than God is in a state of radical ontological indigence, or al-faqr al-dhati, meaning everything in the universe is merely contingent. Everything other than God is merely contingent. And so it is perpetually in need of God to sustain it and bring it about and maintain it in existence. In this sense, God is al-illatul fa'ila, or the efficient cause. So not only is the contingent, not only is all that is other than God in need of him to exist, but also to act as well. And this applies to inanimate objects also. not just humans and animals who obviously are able to make certain kinds of choices and act. The sense of the word act here is used in contrast to another term in philosophy, which is potency. If you can think of act as actuality and potency as potentiality. So for anything to truly exist and fully actualize its potentialities and thus truly manifest its full nature, for that it is also dependent fully upon God. The existence and actions of all things are fully encompassed by God's power, and they derive the totality of their respective capacities, because that's what a power is. They derive that capacity from the divine omnipotence. Now, does that mean that God can do anything? Because that's really what we're debating here. That's really the question at hand. And the answer hinges upon how we understand the term anything. Indeed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can cause to exist or make to happen anything that could, in principle, exist or happen. However, if by anything we mean Allah causing a contradiction to come into being, such as his making a triangular square or a triangular cube or something like that, then the answer is no. In the case of a triangle cube, a cube is a three-dimensional object. It has 6 square faces, and a triangle is a flat plane figure with 3 sides. The nature of the one completely excludes the nature of the other. It is as absolutely meaningless then to speak of a triangular cube as it is to speak of God creating one. Now, this is not because there is any kind of limitation to God's power. His capacity remains all-encompassing. But what I mean by this is that there is no such thing as the capacity to create a round square or a triangular cube or something of that nature. No such capacity exists. So God cannot lack something which does not in itself exist. So there is no such capacity in the first place. No such thing can exist. Now, many people have, often ask the question, particularly atheists, they have a favorite question, can God create a stone that is too heavy for him to lift? And the atheist thinks that he's really cornered the believer when he asks this question, because no matter what the believer says, if he says yes, then that means he can't lift the stone and there's something he can't do. And if he says no, that means he can't do something again because he can't create it. What it really comes down to, though, is God can certainly cause a stone to levitate into the air if he wanted to. And at the same time, he could prevent any stone from rising up off of the ground. And those are the two options there, in truth. And the two cannot be realized at the same time. It's a logical contradiction. And so, again, it's because there is no such capacity in the first place. So that is what is meant by divine omnipotence, namely that God is capable of doing and acting in all kinds of non-contradictory ways. That leaves us with what is meant by good and bad and evil. And what does it mean then to say that God is perfectly good? Such judgments regarding something being good or bad are not all instances of subjective taste. We can speak of such and such a thing being a good or a bad specimen of that kind of thing. For example, if someone wants to buy a watermelon, hinduane, and he notices that this watermelon has some kind of a defect, it has a dent, it has a scratch, the color, he can tell it's not a good watermelon. It's not a good watermelon. Then such a watermelon may be objectively characterized as, namely, a bad watermelon. Why? Because that watermelon fails to fully realize what it means to be a watermelon because of the defect in question. Now, such a defect represents a lack, a privation of some quality which, were it present, would have fully actualized the essence of being a watermelon in the full sense of the term, namely a good watermelon. Thus, we may speak of a good or a bad instance or a specimen of a watermelon, of a tree, of a house, a bicycle, a car, a motorcycle, in the sense of that thing's being successful, or that thing's success, so to speak, or failure, so to speak, in living up to the standard inherent in the kind of thing it is, namely its essence, the essence of the watermelon, the essence of the tree, or whatever you have, whatever is in question. In philosophy, that's called al-mahiyatu bil-ma'na al-a'am. In any case, when we come to moral goodness or badness, and here we would take the term badness as being synonymous, and we'll use it interchangeably with the term evil. So moral goodness and badness or evil only apply to the volitional acts, the freely performed actions of human beings. And so goodness applies to, as a term, applies to a freely chosen act that facilitates the realization of the potentials latent in a human being, which, given their essence or nature, they are in need of realizing in order to fully flourish. Similarly, badness as a term applies to a freely chosen act that frustrates the realization of such potentialities in the human being. Good actions lead to a movement of the soul from potentiality to actuality in the realization of human flourishing, in contrast to bad actions, which hamper and frustrate this noetic movement, or this movement of the soul, this transformational process. Goodness then involves being actual in some way. That is to say, in the realization of what is only latent and implicit in the nature or essence of a thing. Then evil would involve a failure to be actual in some way. That is to say, in a way that fails to realize what is only latent and implicit, once again, in that nature of the thing. And so badness or evil is seen to be a privation. That is to say, it is seen to be the absence of something which a fully actualized instance or specimen of the thing in question would or should possess by virtue of its nature. Goodness is related to presence, and therefore related to existence, to wujud, to hasti, whereas badness or evil is related to absence and non-existence, to adam, to nisti. Goodness is a kind of actuality, fi'l, and badness is a kind of unrealized potentiality, or quwwat. All things other than God are a mixture of potency and act, potentiality and actuality. God is pure actuality without any potentiality. He is absolute simplicity of act in action and has no intrinsic or extrinsic parameters, boundaries, limits, or restrictions, and is capable of unrestrictedly acting in all non-contradictory ways. Thus, he is pure goodness, and there is no trace of badness or evil in God. This, then, is what I mean by good and evil, and what it means to say that God is wholly good. So we come back to the question, and that question comes down to this. Is the existence of evil in the world logically consistent with God's existence? And of course, the atheist view is that no, it's not logically consistent, it's inconsistent. And of course, there we're assuming that God is, of course, omnipotent, all-powerful, and of course, wholly good. Now, why does this conclusion, in other words, the conclusion that God does not exist, follow from the existence of evil in the world? It is not true to say without qualification that there are no limits to what an omnipotent being can do. Once again, this is not due to any lack of capacity on the part of the omnipotent being to be able to create something or bring about some state of affairs, but rather because if the thing or state of affairs in question is self-contradictory, then such a capacity does not exist in the first place. So God does not violate this law of non-contradiction, and this is a fundamental law in logic, and as well as it has its use in metaphysics as well. So If it be the case that there are some instances of good which cannot logically be realized without allowing evils to exist as well, then even God could not cause such instances of good to occur without allowing those evils to exist as well, any more than he could make a round square. So divine omnipotence is not logically inconsistent with the existence of evil. In other words, those evils are necessary for the realization of some other good. At the same time, it is also not true that a perfectly good being would eliminate all evil from the world. To eliminate some evils may entail elimination of those instances of good that presuppose the existence of those evils. So even if God could eliminate such evils, he may well choose not to do so in order to preserve those goods. Now, what is meant by a good that presupposes the existence of some evil, you might ask? Many examples can be found in the in child raising children, for example. A father or a mother must ensure that the child studies diligently, completes his assignments, does not dine exclusively on chocolates and candies, however unpleasant these experiences may be for the child. Similarly, in order to excel in any form of sports, for example, considerable hardship and sacrifice, physical, mental, emotional, and so forth, is required. And indeed, it is easy to see that no goal worthy of attainment is without some degree of struggle and hardship. All of these examples constitute the efficient cause for the realization of very important latent potencies in the human soul. Let us consider, for the sake of argument, what sort of goods would cease to exist in the world if all evil were eliminated from the world. Human beings have free will. Thus, they are capable of committing evil, and history bears witness to the fact that they often have done so, and a great many of them have. It is also clear that in order to eliminate all evil from the world, then, free will would also have to be taken out of the equation. Now, what kind of creature would result? Whatever that creature would be, it certainly would not be a human being as we understand the term, but some other sort of creature altogether. Moreover, there would also be no meaningful notion of moral responsibility of such a creature, as well as any notion of divine reward or punishment. Therefore, the removal of all evil from the world is not logically consistent with free will. Now, I've so far only considered evil in the moral sense, but what about natural disasters, tsunamis, earthquakes, and so forth? These two would also have to be eliminated by God in such a scenario, and we would be left with a very strange world indeed, a world in which I would argue many important goods would not be realized due to the removal of free will. But someone might say, well, why does God have to take away free will from everyone? Why doesn't he just make everybody perfectly good so that they still have the free will, they have the capacity to commit murder and thievery and what have you and lying, but they just don't do it? Well, yes, there's no problem. God could certainly do that, and then everyone would effectively be some kind of a ma'soom. But then we would have to admit that even though important moral choices would be made in such a world, people abstaining from murder and killing and theft and so forth, but it does not follow that in such a world, all the moral goods that exist in our world would be realized as well in that world. Now, why is that? The reason for this is that there would still remain instances of the exercise of free will which demand, which necessitate, which require the existence of persons who commit evil. Mercy and forgiveness can only be exercised toward one who has committed, one who has wronged you. Now, the latter is also primitive and thus comes under the notion of badness or evil. Patience also, forbearance, these can only be realized in the face of hardship and adversity. Courage and fortitude are only possible in the face of danger to life, to property, to status, and the like. Compassion and empathy cannot be realized without those who have suffered misfortune. Sacrifice is not possible without the loss of that which one holds dear. All of these apply also in the case of natural disasters. Therefore, it must be borne in mind very well that the question at stake is not merely one of the goodness of free will in the abstract, or even merely of morally significant free choices, but of those morally significant actions which contribute to the realization and development of virtues of the sort which we just listed. Another objection might be raised that even if God permits such evils in order that human beings may develop the full range of their virtues, courage, fortitude, mercy, all those things we said, it nevertheless stands to reason that at least some instances of evil and suffering that actually do exist and happen in the world could have been prevented by an omnipotent God without losing a greater good or bringing about some equally bad or worse evil. Therefore, such a person would argue it is still possible that an omnipotent, holy, good God does not exist. I would say that this might be a valid objection were it not for the fact that there are other very abundant logical demonstrations and apodictic proofs, burhans as we call them, barahin, for the existence of God, and that such a logical demonstration can be developed further to establish God's uniqueness, his omniscience, his omnipotence, perfect goodness, as well as other attributes independent of this question of evil. But for such an objection really to have force, then all these other arguments would also have to be refuted. In any case, one can reply to such an objection by saying that, oh, you know, even so, God could still eliminate certain evils without affecting all those other nice goods that we would like to have in the world. Well, the reply to that objection is that it's not at all an established fact that some instances of evil and suffering that actually exist in our world could have been prevented in this way. How does the objector know that this particular instance of evil could be eliminated without affecting everything else? We simply do not have a complete and fully detailed knowledge of the totality of all instances of evil and their concomitant goods, the goods that go with them or don't go with them at any given moment. And therefore, such an objection collapses under its own assumptions. Therefore, I would conclude that the perfect goodness of God is not logically inconsistent with the existence of evil. I truly hope that this rational demonstration is of some benefit and gives and maybe a means of consolation to anyone and everyone who is vexed by the presence of evil in the world and in their lives. Rational demonstration, logical argument, proofs of this kind, and consolation as well are not mutually exclusive. Human beings are made for wisdom, and it is that which truly puts heart at mind at ease. Wallahu a'lam, and Allah knows best. Thank you very much for listening.
Allahumma salli
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.
Okay, we have few minutes for question and answer. I ask you please keep your questions or comments short. If you want, you can write your questions in the chat box, and then Dr. Ahmad can answer if you don't want to ask directly.
Okay.
But if you have any question, please keep it short, and we have like maybe 15 minutes to allocate for question and answer. So if there's any question.
I'm also sorry, my apologies. I think I went a few minutes over, but not too much. I hope not too much.
Thank you so much. It was a great speech, and I think everybody.
It was a bit philosophical, but as I said, it was more of a reflection, but there was a big philosophical element. But I think that this is an important question, and many people, they kind of think about it at some point or another in their lives. And in fact, it came up recently among some people I know, and I thought it might be interesting to discuss it anyway.
I do have a question, if I may.
Please.
Okay, so I did a quick research on this notion of adversity and affliction and plague and things like that in the Quran, and the Quran uses different terminology like musibah, like bala, like fitna. Those were the three that, that I came across in my
Yeah.
cursory research. And the sense I got was that the Quran doesn't actually address the issue of the proximate, what we call proximate causality of events.
Indeed.
So making kind of straight line from, for example, the COVID-19 to God, I think is a little bit problematic from a Quranic perspective. But also, what I came across was that the Quran also uses at least the term fitna as a mechanism for people to recalibrate, to rebalance, and maybe even to redefine their relationship with the unseen, with the alam al-ghayb, right? But then
Yes.
it's not actually very hopeful that they will take the right lessons from it. Like I got the sense that, if we call these black swan events,
yes,
the Quran is not very optimistic that the black swan events would deliver on that exogenous shock effects in terms of awakening people and making people more humble. I'm just wondering, where your thinking is on that question. Number one, question of proximate causality, and number two, the fact that the Quran is a little bit, I would say, not very rosy on the eventual outcome of these exogenous shocks in terms of, like I said, humiliating people, making them, a better version of themselves, and so forth.
That's a very, very good question indeed. Before I directly attempt a response, and I don't know that you were actually trying to say this. I wasn't drawing any straight line to COVID or anything or any other event. I was trying to speak in general, and even when I began the talk, I said the peculiar historical circumstances. I try and stay, especially when giving a talk of this kind, where the philosophical element is involved, to try and keep a high level of generality and not. So I wasn't trying to say that. Nevertheless, your point is well taken regarding proximate causality, proximate causes. That is a very good question. The Quran is not really a book of philosophy, and those examples, those terms which you gave, they all have occurred in some sort of a context, because when these kind of events are mentioned, and you referred to them as black swan events, alluding to this. I don't know if you were alluding to the book by Nicholas Nassim Taleb entitled The Black Swan. It was a very interesting book, which I actually have read, about these presumably statistically unlikely events which some system is not prepared to handle. And hence there's an exogenous shock, as you very eloquently put it. So the Quran, first of all, is not a book of philosophy. And I would have to look at those specific examples with respect to the next part of your question, saying it's not optimistic. Well, God may not have been optimistic, if that's the right way of putting it, about those people in general, or where that situation was mentioned, whether it was the people of Lot or the people of Lut or the people of Ad or Thamud, or I'm just saying some names of some not in any particular order off the top of my head. But I do think that especially with the passage of time and the further and further away we move in history, so to speak, from the origin, from the principle, from God, and from direct interventions by God in history through his sending of prophets. And so the further and further we move away from the age of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I think that the capacity for goodness is still there, but the majority of people tend not to learn or exercise, learn enough from those experiences to exercise it. And so there I would have to agree. I do think that there is, with the passage of time, this hardening of the hearts of people, and that's really what it is. And then people becoming more and more heedless not really interested in doing what is right. And you look around in our own society, you see, there's a constant debate. Now we're becoming rather particular about when I was trying to keep things general. But again, let's just, you find that there is a great deal of discussion in American society about freedom, about liberty. And you can apply that to the recent event, this recent lockdown and so forth. But whether we talk about this notion of liberty in reference to the current lockdown and the COVID situation, or at any other point in American history, let's make it very specific, they don't talk about what is good. There's just this notion of freedom, this abstract notion of an absence of restrictions. And so the very notion of the good has been lost, because the prevailing zeitgeist or spirit of the age is that there are no objective moral values. There's only situational or relativist ethics. Hence, many Americans will say, well, in my book or in my opinion, such and such thing is okay and such thing is not okay. And it may not be that for you, and so on and so forth. So I think with the passage of time, there has been, rather than a progress in human affairs, there has been a regress, so to speak, a falling away really from our true human nature, and not living up to our human nature, and falling away from the ideal of humanity, the ideals of true humanity, and it falling into a kind of almost, and I realize this might be something very harsh to say, but look at the shocking and events which we have seen in the 20th century, and now, and we continue to see in this century, falling into the subhuman, almost the infrahuman. And I think that's most unfortunate, but that is the nature of things. And if it were not the case, then the world will not end, and it must end. Just as all human beings will die one day, and each one will taste of death, so too this created order will cease. We don't know when, but it certainly is inexorably moving toward that.
Maybe I can follow up with that.
Dr. Misbahi, good to see you. Very nice to see you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
It's a heavy discussion, especially after iftar. It will be difficult to digest this.
Yes.
I think this discussion perhaps maybe deserves more attention maybe later on sometimes.
Certainly.
I think Dr. Humayun Bash gave a talk on those typologies of how Quran characterizes bala, fitne, and
really.
So on. And I said that in response to his talk that that lack of optimism in Quranic rendition is almost immediate, that this happens to you, I save you,
right, and
then you forget. So forgetfulness is a central theme in the Quran, and one wonders, how this forgetfulness could be overcome, but what type of rationality. So that has been my own preoccupation,
right?
That rationality, the way, even in the most profound philosophical version of it, that some of the Islamic philosophers piggyback on with the Western types and the Greeks, it has a fundamental limitations. In other words, people knowingly ignore things and therefore respond to a different type of instinct, or whatever that is, So for me, that's a contradiction between the meaning of life as a paradigm, and the imminency of life. The imminency, which is now and here, and they both exist. And I think the imminency is so fundamental to forgetfulness. And I think it's so connected. So whether Islamic rationality in terms of wisdom is fundamentally different, and if it is, how could it be taught without focusing on the other element of faith, which is taking a chance and throwing yourself at, accepting, and then seeing what. I mean, tonight, Mr. Tabibi read
Yes.
I think I don't know whether you were connected by that time.
No, because I just broke my fast 30 minutes and then came, so yeah, I couldn't tune
It's a citation from Hazrat Imam Hassan,
in.
salawatullah alayhi, which says in translation, he who trusts whatever Allah has chosen for him to be good, will never wish to be in any situation other than what Allah has chosen for him to be in. So in other words, this fundamental surrendering, whether that would come with sequentially after a wisdom, always, or it is a different category of knowing, actually. It happens to some, it doesn't happen to others. And as I've always been thinking about this, actually, you know, that whether people get lucky to get it, or it's always in a struggle. And therefore, we have to live with forgetfulness. And therefore, the remedy or antidote to forgetfulness is what? And I think this idea that what role Sharia plays, what role your daily praise plays, what role your preoccupation with what you have to do on daily basis has, might be at least one of the threads that allows you that you may forget, but not completely. And sort of suspense in the air always, between imminency of life and no imminency.
Yes.
Life, you know. So that's why I think that's the challenge is, and that's why, you know, when you have Ramadan, when you have Hajj, when you have your daily prayers, those are the moments that the imminency shifts and change and is questioned. And I think for me, that's the meaning of the ibadah in many ways. And the better you do it, the better you have a chance of maybe connecting to that wisdom that you were talking about. And in other words, wisdom not as a mechanical A plus B plus C plus D, whatever, but something else. Not to ignore that, I'm just saying that something else that you need to have in order to have the meaningful of life as the most eminent things in your life, rather than your own life as you live it. You breathe, you eat, your food, you have needs and all that. So that was my sort of reaction to Dr. Humayun Bash's talk, and also somewhat connected to your talk.
Yeah, very good. I wish I had been able to attend Dr. Humayun Bash's talk. That would have been very interesting. But just in reference to what you have just said, I do think, yes, that Sharia offers a kind of a framework. You need to have a certain framework or boundaries, and of course, it's very, very good to be open-minded and, you know, to read other philosophies and other religions and so forth. And I'm very much one of those, adhere to that. But being open-minded is like, you know, you have a room, you're sitting in your library, and you open a window and you allow the light to come in. That window cannot be there unless there are walls, and the wall is the Sharia. It's like the structure. And so I think that's quite important. And we have our commitments to our respective traditions, naturally. But then if you want to speak to someone outside of the Islamic tradition, when you were saying, you know, how do you teach that to people, or how would we discuss that? I think that we have very good examples in our own Islamic intellectual tradition. And unlike what many people would like to lead you to believe today, and what certain Muslims are also laboring under such an illusion, is that Islam was somehow a monolithic civilization. It never was. It's always been a very cosmopolitan sort of civilization, and very, very rich in its intellectual history, considering how young it is relative to, let's say, a Chinese civilization or Indic civilization and so forth. And there's a very interesting book that's pretty old. It was written in Arabic. It's called Al-Hikmatul Khalida by Miskawayh, the famous ethicist who was the elder contemporary of Ibn Sina. And it was actually based on a text which was a survival from Sassanid Persia. And the text was in Pahlavi and was known as Javidan Khirad. And Miskawayh took and made a translation. There was an Arabic translation, and he then added further sayings of wisdom from other civilizations. So the Prophet ﷺ, Imam Ali alayhi salam, their sayings are there, but also those of Aristotle, of Plato, of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Persian sages. And we find this theme again of an ancient pre-Islamic Persian wisdom and an ancient Greek pre-Islamic wisdom as well in Shihabuddin al-Suhrawardi Maqtul, who referred to it as Khamiratul Azal. And so I think that in works, for example, which are also really, at least at one time, they were part of the Western canon, which has received quite a beating with postmodernism and all of these things. But the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle, it's not a dogmatic work. Anybody can read it, and Christians have read it, and others have read it, and people have copied it in the different traditions or been heavily influenced by it. And similarly, the tradition of Stoicism, the Stoic thought and Stoic philosophy in figures such as, most eloquently is, I think, Marcus Aurelius and his Meditations, which, although he was a Roman emperor, he wrote that in Greek. The Meditations originally are in Greek, and we have the thought and writings of Seneca.
Mm-hmm.
We have the thoughts and writings of Cicero. These used to be part of the Western canon, and cultured persons, udaba, someone who was steeped in their traditions, they would have learned these. But nowadays people don't do this. They just watch television and Netflix and Instagram and whatever else they're doing. So all of that has fallen by the wayside, unfortunately.
Okay, maybe one more question, and then inshallah we end our session with dua iftatah that is recommended to recite in the nights of Ramadan. If there is any other question. I have one question.
Sure.
You talked about this example. For example, atheists, they say that, is it possible, is God capable of making a stone that he can't lift it? So
Yeah.
this, and you said that because it is a contradiction, that God's or Allah's capability doesn't apply to them. Is it going back to the capability of God or the impossibility of such a contradiction? So I'm just, a little bit wondering that, does it go that capability doesn't exist, or that situation doesn't exist?
The capacity for it doesn't exist because the situation cannot exist. I didn't say capability, I said capacity. So that capacity itself does not exist from the start. And you see, the law of non-contradiction is a law in logic, and it says that when it's applied to propositions, if you have some proposition P, then that proposition cannot be simultaneously true and false at the same time in the same sense. And metaphysically, that means that you have wujud and you have adam. And there is no middle ground between wujud and adam. There is no middle ground. There is no intermediate ontological state between existence and non-existence, just as there is no intermediate logical state or condition between affirmation and denial, between nafi and isbat. And that's why that question itself is not well framed, because levitating a stone in the air and just holding it down so that it cannot be levitated are two mutually exclusive states. And so the capacity to realize that does not even exist. Otherwise, Allah's all power, his omnipotence, his all powerfulness encompasses all capacities, but it doesn't encompass that which does not itself exist. And this is the universe that God made. I don't know, perhaps it's possible for there to be a universe in which contradictories can be realized. I have no clue. But the universe in which we live, to use a term from from differential equations, this is a key boundary condition. These are one of the boundary conditions. So the laws of logic, the three main laws of logic, these laws of thought, they are logical, but they apply also in the metaphysical realm. They have their metaphysical analogs. So the three fundamental laws of thought and logic are the law of identity, that A is A or P is P. It just means that a thing is whatever it is. Metaphysically, it means that if you have a particular mahiyat, a particular quiddity or essence, it realizes or lives up to its quiddity or its essence. It manifests its qualities, right? Because it is a mumkinul wujud, whatever is there, if it exists, then it realizes those. And then you have the law of non-contradiction, which I just talked about. And metaphysically, that means, again, that there is no intermediate ground between existence and non-existence. And then there's something called the law of excluded middle, which means that any proposition P is either true or it's not true. So again, that's a kind of a version of the law of non-contradiction. And those are the three laws of thought. And then there are a couple of other things that apply in qazaya or in syllogisms, but this isn't a class on logic, and I hope I've answered your question.